so many athletes are now creators and you can connect in a more authentic way. Don't just slap your logo on the game and be done with it.
Right.
Like actually go down and do something at the grassroots level.
Welcome to the Human Tell podcast. I'm your host, Lolita Morrow. There's something powerful happening beyond the scoreboard. Women's sports are capturing hearts, headlines, and hashtags, and not just because of the wins, but because of what they represent. You see, these athletes aren't just playing the game, they're changing it. And fans are responding not out of habit, but out of belief. But what's really fueling this surge? Who are these fans? Why are they showing up, tuning in, and reshaping the culture of sports? We're diving into that question from two powerful perspectives: the data that's defining fandom and the storytelling that's amplifying it. Joining me today are two incredible voices in the space. I'm joined by Arti Bhaskaran, the global head of insights for Snapchat. Arti is a respected voice in helping category-leading brands understand social media and the creator economy. Arti's team recently released a comprehensive study on the scope of the opportunities in women's sports and how Snapchat is a unique arena for connecting with fans. We'll talk about some of that work today. Welcome, Arti. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Now, Arti and I are joined by Sandy Padula of Scripps Networks. Sandy heads up enterprise and consumer research for a suite of TV networks that includes ION, one of the premier broadcast partners for the WNBA and the NWSL, as well as the home of several new events in women's sports, including the Sports Illustrated Women's Games, which will feature all-star competitions across flag football, volleyball, combat sports, and more. Welcome, Sandy. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's really great to be speaking with both of you.
Yes. All right. So we have a lot of exciting content to cover. So, pun intended, let the games begin. I think a great way to start off this conversation is really just starting with the big picture. So let's sort of talk about the scope of opportunity. I mean, we've all felt it, right? The attention, the energy, the viewership. All of those things around women's sports have exploded in the last several years. Arti, I'll start with you. I was digging into Snap's research, and some of the numbers were pretty eye-opening. I'm going to just restate a couple of those stats. The first one, 44% of 13 to 44-year-olds are fans of women's sports. But 62% of all sports fans say they're fans of women's sports. And that number is even higher among Snapchat users. And then finally, over half of them say that the interest is still growing in that arena. Now, those numbers alone are huge. Can you tell us more and sort of how did you define fandom and what stood out the most for you from these numbers?
Yeah, absolutely. And those numbers that you quoted is not just US. We covered 7 markets across the world, across whether it's EMEA or APAC. And really the genesis of the research was because we're seeing all this interest and we wanted to understand, is this a flash in the pan? Is this something that's growing? Should we, as a platform, be an active participant? And way we looked at fandom is you're not just viewing sports, you're actively passionate about it, both at an individual level and you have collective enthusiasm for it. And what we observed is, like you rightly quoted, one, there's a lot of overlap between current sports fans who are now getting into the women's sports phase, but women's sports are also attracting a whole generation of net new fans. Not our research, but even work done by other companies. I think there was a study by Unilever that quoted that the growth in women's sports is driven by Gen Z And 39% of them have increased their interest in women's sports or entering. So I feel like there's a whole generation of fans who are entering sports through women's sports. And your existing sports fans are expanding their repertoire, if you will, and going beyond men's sports to watch and follow and be fans of a whole host of women's sports.
Yeah. Were you surprised at all by how large and diverse that fan base has become?
I was a little bit, to be honest. I have also noticed personally interest in women's sports growing. I'm originally from India, huge cricket fan, and women's cricket, who
Yes.
just won the World Cup, by the way, woohoo.
All
Um,
right.
the league interest has been growing year on year. So I was expecting good numbers, but not the great numbers that I saw. So in that way, it was very heartening in terms of what we got out of the research. I think what was surprising to me is the extent of fandom that's already been built. So it's not just people saying, yes, I'm interested in women's sports, I watch a game now and then, but really calling themselves as true fans of whatever leagues that they follow. And that's why when we even asked them, what is the favorite league that you follow, WNBA was the fifth league. Obviously, I would expect NFL and Premier League and all of them to be in the top 10. But for WNBA to break into top 10, that was like super surprising.
Wow. Did that create any additional opportunities for Snap as a platform?
Of course. I mean, sports
Yeah.
is a huge passion, right? And we're all about bringing passions to life, and you're connecting with your close friends and family over passion. So sports has always been a big part of the platform. And even on the platform, WNBA content viewership and engagement has increased 300% year on year. So we are actively having more partnerships in terms of content on the platform. And this year, Snap launched something called Snap School, where it went and kind of gathered a group of athletes, female athletes, to train them to be content creators and kind of figure out how to monetize what they do. Because I'm sure we'll talk about it later. That's like a huge part of how the fandom is being fueled. So Snap's very active in terms of making sure we have and we provide consumers the opportunity to watch, view, talk about, share sports, and also for athletes and creators to kind of contribute to the fandom.
That's amazing. Sandy, I don't want to leave you out of this at all. Let's sort of shift to, I guess, what you're seeing on the TV side when we talk about ratings, audience growth, awareness. What particular trends are really standing out for you?
Well, I really want to build on what Artie was talking about with the WNBA.
Yeah.
I am new to Scripps. I'm still in my first year here. But I have really seen a lot of momentum across the Scripps portfolio just in the last 6 months that I've been here. And Scripps is really leaning into women's sports more than ever before. We constantly talk about and hear about the fragmented media landscape, but Scripps is really committed to connecting to our audiences through this sports content because it's really become an essential destination for audiences. And our advertising partners have a way to reach them like never before. And really, Scripps is recognizing that we have a distribution system here that is a huge advantage in a time when pay TV is sort of declining. So our premium sports on our national networks and our news on linear and fast, we're in a unique position to be competitive. So when advertising partners are sharing their business concerns with us, whether it's declining reach or kind of lack of transparency, we're able to assure them that through our nationally distributed network, we're kind of immune to cord cutting, and we can really start to connect with audiences at scale. And so we've made this early investment in women's sports, and the growing fandom and advertiser demand that has really proven that women's sports is a transformation, just not a trend. And to the point about NBA and its fandom, that WNBA on ION grew 133% year over year. I mean, in a time when so many things are declining, that fandom of the WNBA just continues to grow and really do well for us. The other thing we've noticed is Artie, to your point about younger fans being really engaged, beyond the league fandom, we're seeing a lot more athlete fandom. And athletes themselves, the women themselves who are working really hard to elevate their sports, have become something, a bit of a rock star with these younger sports viewers and these younger WNBA fans. So it's something that we're really leaning into.
You said something that stood out. You said it is a transformation, not a trend. Is that what you said? I love that. I love
Yes,
that.
I really think that women's sports in general, we're just at the tip of the iceberg here.
Yeah.
You know, we have a lot of growth to happen with women's sports, and we're seeing that across a number of different types of sports too. The interest level in all the different genres just continues to grow.
Yeah, that's what I was actually going to ask you next. That does having women's sports content in rotation actually help fuel that greater fan interest overall? And it sounds like it does.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I think we'll start to see in the coming years. We have had two sports on Ion so far, WNBA and NWSL. But just recently, we have announced two more sports connections, or sports franchises. The Athlos track and field event that we just held last month, and the Major League Volleyball that we announced that will be premiering. The Championship League will be premiering next May on Ion. In addition to the SI Women's Games that you mentioned, WNBA, it's really a portfolio of sports content that is growing on Scripps.
That sort of leads us into diving more into why people are really connecting, so deeply with women's sports. The question is, are fans coming to women's sports for the same reason they follow men's sports, or is it something completely different that's driving the connection? Going back to the HumanTel study, we saw that fans of women's sports were about 50% more likely to say they find women's sports inspirational and empowering more compared to men's games. Artie, I'll pass this back to you. I know that your research did find similar themes, what women's sports align with in terms of forward-thinking values like social progress, empowerment. And similarly in the HumanTel work, it showed that women's sports experience can very much be about fighting equality or accomplishing change and feeling uplifted. Can you speak a little bit to what you feel is behind that connection?
Yeah, I mean, this was one of my favorite parts of the research. You never know what you get, when you do research.
Yeah.
And we were like, what are the values that people associate with women's sports, and how does it change compared to men's sports? And I expected things like teamwork and sportsmanship to come up, but along with that, we had aspects like passion and empowerment and progress and inspiration coming up for women's sports, whereas the men's sports are, I would say now, I guess you can call them the more traditional value of power and strength and speed. I mean, you have to keep in mind, men's sports have been ingrained into society for decades now, right? Whereas
Right.
women's sports always in the fringes and now coming to mainstream. So it was so interesting to see that women's sports tend to be a way more value-driven movement than more to do with just focusing on the physicality of it. It's still there. Like I told you, the teamwork and the skill, it's still there. But it was very interesting to see that it's about progress and empowerment, and also about like building a community more than anything.
Sandy, do you have any thoughts in terms of coverage and like the advertiser tone, things that you're seeing on your side of the business?
Well, just to build on Artie's point about attitudes and behaviors, we're really seeing that same thing about fandom to league versus fandom to team versus fandom to athlete, it is very different when it comes to women's sports. That fandom to both the athlete and the team are very different than with men's sports. There is a lot more lean in to these athletes and how they are showing up. There's a lot more support for these athletes as individuals than we see with men's sports. And the differences in demographics is really striking. Much lower among older audiences for the athlete fandom than there is for younger audiences. And that's where we're really seeing the growth happen too.
So you find the older audiences are not connecting as much with the specific athlete as the younger fans?
That's right. We're seeing a lot more connection with the athletes, specifically among 18 to 34-year-olds and 25 to 49-year-olds. Avid WNBA fans are much more connected to the athlete than they are say a specific team or the league in general. I mean, by double. It's half of our fans who are avid WNBA fans are much more connected to the athlete.
Yeah, we see that on our platform as well, because obviously for Snap, 90% of Gen Z are on Snap. So you would see whatever behavior you see among the younger audience, it gets heightened on the platform. And you're so right, Sandy. It's now athlete first, then league, or athlete, then maybe team, then league, in terms of, I guess, the grade of fandom, if you will.
Yeah. And that's actually going into are all fans the same? I guess because they're not. For instance, in the HumanTel data, we did find that women who are fans of women's sports are less prone to some of the, I guess you could say, negative aspects of fandom, like, letting the outcome of the game influence their mood. I have that problem. I'm a Dallas Cowboy fan. I'm sorry. Yes. Feel my pain. Or, even letting fandom become too much of their identity, and that even goes into, sports gambling. What have you both learned about the audience differences, whether it's age, gender, or motivation?
And I think Sandy kind of hit the point in terms of you do see differences in age of how fandom's being built. And I think the difference that we are seeing is also the values that we spoke about as to what is motivating somebody to follow women's sport. And the fact that most of them come to women's sports because they want this, they want to feel part of a community, They want a sense of community around something that's positive and something that is empowering. And you're seeing that in women's sports. I think if you look at, again, very historic men's sports, the way it was developed is you would play in school, you would play in high school, you'll play in college, and then your family will have your team and you will watch generation matches with your dad, etc.
Right.
That's not there for women's sports. So the entry to women's sports is very much motivated by, I think, the values and what is the benefit that you want from the game that's not tied to always winning,
That is it's so interesting because even though we are doing studies that are completely independent of each other, Snap's done amazing work in this space, HumanTel's done amazing work in this space, and Scripps is doing amazing work in this space, if I do say so myself. But all three of these independent works are finding the exact same drivers. They're finding the exact same takeaways here. And it's one of the things about having these younger audiences so engaged with these athletes is that it's actually easier for us to find them and to convert them over to the telecast, because the telecast and watching the game is still the number one way they want to connect. And as Scripps continues to build connections for our advertisers and our audiences, we want to make sure that we're pointing them back to the telecast however we can. And, traditional advertising is more difficult for us to convert people over. But being able to use social media where these younger viewers are to convert them over to that live telecast has been very instrumental in our growth.
I remember when I was in college, I'm going to try to say this without dating myself, but the WNBA had sort of just started. And prior to that, if you were a female and you played basketball, you had a couple of options. You had to go overseas, or, maybe you could coach somewhere, and it wasn't really a lot of things you could do within the United States. And since that time, I've seen, younger female fans, look up to these athletes and follow them along their journey. And it's almost a sense of, I can do that too, to your point of like motivation. Whereas typical sports, you're like, it's all about the fandom. It's all about the score. It's all about where they're ranking in conferences. That's also important, but it gives that ability of, this is something that I can do. I feel tied to this community. I see myself in these athletes. When we talk about younger fans, especially Gen Z, they do see sports, and you both have touched on this. They see sports as a way to connect, a way to belong, and have these shared experiences. I know that Snapchat found that over 6 in 10 users said following women athletes makes them feel a part of the community. And I think that's really important. Sandy, you also touched on just the sense of community and still capturing that through television, and how Scripps is really able to bring that spirit into the coverage. I want to sort of take that and look at sort of that brand opportunity, right? So if we take this idea further and talk a little bit about how brands can be a part of this community in an authentic way. Brands are constantly trying to show up authentically and not make it seem sort of cookie cutter or fake, ways that can add to the experience for all. I know both Snap and HumanTel research really demonstrate that fans are a lot more likely to be supportive of brands that show that they can support women's sports. I'd love to get each of your take on that, because really the brand affinity and the intersection of that with sports is something that's also very important in this landscape.
Yeah, 100%. Again, I feel like because people have seen the role that brands play in sports in general, they have a certain expectation for a brand that needs to be met by brands. So a lot of the women's sports fans, we even asked them, like, would you like to see brands on sports? In what way? And most of them are like, well, we've already built the community, so we want brands to either support the growth or start building other communities. And we know that visibility is a problem. I'm like, it's fantastic that Scripps is promoting women's sports in such a great way, because reach and visibility is the key way in which you can drive revenue, and money is going to talk for women's sports. So they want brands to be able to support those kind of visibility and reach builders. And I think it's because they've seen brands, be sponsors of men's sports. And they're like, well, if you're doing that, I want you to do the same for women's sports and not give them, a treatment that's any less. And the way in which brands can authentically connect, because a lot of this women's sports is driven by younger audiences, is to speak to them where they are and speak to them in ways that's relatable. So creators are an excellent way to go about it. So many athletes are now creators, and you can connect in a more authentic way. Don't just slap your logo on the game and be done with it.
Right.
Like, actually go down and do something at the grassroots level, because that's what's missing, right? If you look at a lot of women athletes, their lifespan is so much shorter right now compared to a male athlete. And a lot of them in university are already thinking about a career that's not sports, right? So how do you support them at grassroots and you build them up is very critical. So you're not just supporting the Serena Williams of the world, right? You're supporting a lot more athletes and a lot more leagues and a lot more games. So I would say it's one, help build reach, which is fantastic, but also help build the grassroots.
I want to build on, if you don't mind, the idea of reach, and it's to me, reach equals awareness, or awareness
Mhm.
equals reach, and sort of chicken and the egg thing. And a big part of our commitment to women's sports and what makes it different is our commitment to democratizing access to it. Because so much of live sports content out there is behind a paywall. And
Yeah.
as consumers become increasingly dissatisfied with kind of just the rising cost of subscription fees, or how many different subscriptions you have to really be able to connect with all the sports that you want to watch, we believe it's essential for these teams and leagues and the dedicated fans who follow them to really have more accessibility. And that's where we've really connected with our advertisers and helped them understand that not only does Scripps provides high quality premium sports, but it's outside of a paywall. And then also in terms of awareness, we have a lot of predicted growth for some pretty big, they're actually a little bit smaller sports leagues now, but there's predicted big growth for them. So, in addition to WNBA, college basketball, Unrivaled, USL Championship Soccer, women's volleyball, and we want to find a way to really increase the visibility of these different sports, because there's a lot of upside to expanding beyond just sort of the traditional women's sports that have the most awareness now. There's a lot of upside to grow awareness to a lot of different types of sports as well.
Do you find is Scripps using more? How are you viewing in-game sort of integrations and storytelling, connecting the actual athletes to just sort of make it a lot more relevant and authentic?
That's exactly it. The storytelling during the in-game conversation
Hmm.
has to be driven towards the athletes and those things that the fans care about. It isn't always just about the rivalry, but it's
Right.
about the person, it's about the people, and that's where Scripps is making connection to the fans, to the athletes, and to the advertiser.
Artie, I wasn't sure if you wanted to say something.
No, I just wanted to comment that it's not just in the US. We see this phenomenon across other markets as well. I know I mentioned women's cricket because it is so top of mind for me, but apparently
Hmm.
in the finals, as per some of the articles I've read, ad rate went up 40% because India made it to the finals and viewership was like double compared to what it was last year. So, if you have great sports, people will come and watch. Um,
Yeah,
and what we want is accessibility. I so agree with Sandy.
yeah. Just staying in line with the athletes. We don't want to forget about the athletes themselves. And I think the next phase of a human health study will actually dig into what values and qualities fans connect with in female athletes. Um, you know, Artie, you mentioned this, and so did you, Sandy. Talk to me a little bit more about athletes as creators. How does the loyalty to an athlete sort of translate into brand love, and then how is that different from, say, I guess like a Tom Brady sort of endorsement model?
Yeah, I mean, what we have noticed, and I've had now the privilege of speaking to some of these athlete creators as well. What we have noticed is that because the fandom for women's sports is built on the sense of community, on the sense of values that we spoke about, a lot of fans who follow athletes just don't want to look at their wins and their
Hmm.
accomplishment, but want to see the behind the scenes. So some of the most popular kind of videos are get ready with me videos, right? Where they're like, this is how I get ready for, a gymnastic tournament. Like Sunili always talks about how her get ready with me are very popular.
Hmm.
A lot of it is about some of the mental health challenges and, how they're building strengths to take on these kind of challenges. Some of these videos are about how most of these athletes are still in college, right? How are they balancing a workload as well as their sporting career and so on? And there's so much interest in things beyond sport for these athletes as they are creating, right? Whether it's personal care, beauty, health, how are they taking care of themselves? What are they eating, etc. That's why I think for brands, again, it's not just athletic brands who are sponsors. I think for women's sports, you can expand and think about it. One of the latest sponsorship is actually with ELF that we have on the platform, which I thought was pretty cool. So it's really about storytelling and looking at behind the scenes of an athlete and what makes them. And the thing about a platform like Snap is you're not taking a photo and kind of polishing up and showing only the perfect version of you on the platform. A lot of them are just doing stories of how they're getting ready. Or I was speaking to this athlete, Kristen Johnson, who's a gymnast at the Tempe University. And she was recently invited to some sporting event, I forget. And she was doing all the behind the scenes of, oh, look who I'm meeting. Oh my God, I got a limo. I'm in a limo for the first time. And
Yeah.
people love it because they get to see the human behind the athlete as they are building their career. And I think that's where brands can connect authentically. You asked me this question before as well, with consumers who are fans, and you find this perfect athlete brand and message fit.
It's almost as if there's so much more to the female athlete, and we want to see how they get ready, what's happening in their day after the game. So that makes the whole person versus, I guess, from a male sports, it is more about the team, the affinity to that sports team. We really want to see the human behind the athlete. And Sandy, are you seeing that the same thing or any reflections on that?
Yes, I think what you're talking about, Artie, is so powerful because it's elevating the athlete to a full 360 picture. We're hearing that fans want to know them as a whole person, and not just not just what they're doing on the court or not just those rivalries with the people that they're playing against, but what the everyday parts of their lives. And it really is, I think, part of what's driving that connection with fans and the athletes themselves beyond the team that they're on. It also allows us to make local and regionalized connections to those athletes and to their local communities as well. We can elevate those stories, and we can connect our advertisers in a way to them in a local way that really connects the fans themselves. And just hearing their stories too of the hard work that they have put in to getting to this level. I think it's sort of understood that the male athletes have been doing this since they were 5 years old, whatever it is, playing football or playing basketball or soccer. And since they were 5 years old, they've been on the field, and women have been too. Women have been working just as long and just as hard, and being able to see those stories and learn more about them is really creating connection.
Yeah. And I think I want to add, you also have to think about the time when women's sports is growing. It's right now. And they have the power to tell their own stories. If you think about athletes in the 80s and the 90s, they really didn't. And it was kind of manufactured story, and you had the legend and you focused on a few superstars, right? Whereas now content is more democratized because of all of the platforms. So people are allowed to take control and tell their stories. And I think a lot of female athletes love that element of it. And also some of them don't have a choice, right? They don't have a ready-made career and that you get drafted out of college if you're really good, right? You have to work hard and prove it. And you're building the game and the league as you're building yourself. So I think that's also a reason why you're seeing a lot of athlete creators and fandom coming in through them as they're telling their stories, because They have the platform, the means, and they know that they need to do it to sustain their career, if you will, right? It's an alternate form of increasing their income as well, if you think about it.
I was thinking about the female athletes as a creator. A lot of times, if someone is drawn to a particular female athlete, let's say a basketball player, and that player plays for a team in New York, if they're traded and they go to another team, it's a little different. You'll still follow that athlete, and now you're still tethered to maybe that New York team and even to women's basketball as a whole. So it even branches out as that athlete may either leave the sport or leave that particular team. And I don't know if that's the same with men's sports. And we echoed this a couple of times. That affinity seems to be a little bit stronger with the actual team or the actual sport itself, whereas the story behind the athlete can carry wherever that athlete may go, even if they step off of the court and they went into the broadcast booth or they went into nonprofit. It's just like a continuation of that connection. And I think that's also important to state as well. Clearly the momentum behind women's sports is just not slowing down. The opportunities for brands, for fans, and even media partners to help shape and continue to shape this next era are massive. And it's deeply meaningful. Between the new events we spoke about, like the Sports Illustrated Women's Games on ION, the upcoming Olympics, or even the growing creator ecosystem, it's fair to say the story is still being written. Artie and Sandy, I want to pass it to you for just sort of your closing thoughts on what you feel is really next for women's sports fandom, as it continues to blossom and grow.
What a question. So many thoughts. I would say that I hope the conversation now moves to what are we going to do about women's sports rather than, is it a movement? Oh my God, there is growth. I'm like, I think we have established that it's here, it's now. It's really about how do you start growing it? How do you start building that reach and awareness? I predict that fandom is only going to grow and get deeper. And there should hopefully be more revenue flowing in to women's sports. I'm seeing a lot of brands sitting up and taking notice, and it's not just a one-off campaign or a sponsorship I'll do here and there and tick a box in the list of goals I need to do. A lot of them are starting to think about more long-term partnerships, right, with athletes and with leagues. So I'm only excited about the growth of women's sports. And I hope that 1 year from now, when we have this conversation, where it's more thinking about which leagues are growing and who's expanding and what are the commonalities that we are seeing across leagues, who are the superstars, and what are the successful case studies of brands that have run a partnership, not just a campaign. So that is really my wish. And I hope brands step up. I think many of them are recognizing the opportunity that there's there, because you're reaching not just existing sports fans, but this entire generation of sports fans in a not so cluttered market. So it's such a great opportunity for brands, and I hope they grab onto it.
I think about when we're looking ahead at the origin of sports fandom for new and growing sports, we can really start to explore those factors that are creating and influencing fans. We talked about league fans, we talked about team fans, we talked about athlete fans, and we can learn from all different layers of fans. We are very passionate about finding those content drivers, long form and short term content that are delivering the most compelling connections to our women's sports fans. And we're still learning. How can we use social media posts to drive live tune in? And at ION, we're really committed to being a premier destination for women's sports. 2 years ago, we rebranded ION from a network primarily focused on procedurals to really being focused on live sports to embrace younger, more affluent audiences, more multicultural audiences, in addition to remaining that vibrant hub for general entertainment procedurals. And we dedicated a whole night to the WNBA Friday Night Spotlight. We launched a new studio in Atlanta where we're producing dedicated pregame and postgame and halftime shows that prioritize storytelling over mere statistics. Where you mentioned before, sharing player profiles and creating compelling narratives. And we're really elevating these stories about the talented female athletes to cultivate those deeper connections with our audiences. And brands have really seen this vision for us. They've understood that the opportunity for women's sports represents a huge growth area in the media landscape. And we're trying to make it easier for them to kind of get in on the action through things like the studio show and other sports brands integrations. So there's a ton of upside for here. We're very committed to women's sports. Last month, we debuted, I mentioned earlier, as the broadcast partner for Athlos, that kind of a first of its kind women's only track and field event. And, that was, reached nearly 4 million viewers. It was really a great success story. And then just last week, we announced the Major League Volleyball premier broadcast partnership to bring championships to ION. And I just really am excited about where we're going to go from here in women's sports and how we're going to elevate these athletes, these teams, and these new and growing sports.
Yeah, you said it, Sandy, the rise of women's sports, it isn't a trend. It's a signal. It's a signal that audiences are ready for authenticity, for progress, and for stories that reflect the world and the world we actually live in and the people in that world. Artie, Sandy, I want to thank you both for joining us today and for helping us unpack what's driving the rise of women's sports. Women's sports reminds us what happens when talent meets purpose, when visibility becomes equity, and when fandom is fueled, not just by insights, but by hope. And as brands, media partners, and fans, we all have a role to play in that story. At HumanTel, we'll continue exploring this topic in future episodes with a deeper look at what connects fans to individual athletes and how that translates into cultural and brand impact. If you all enjoyed today's episode, which I know you did, please like and subscribe wherever you get your podcast to keep learning about why people make the choices they make in food, sports, travel, and more. We'll be back next time to share a little bit more human intelligence from our community. Until then, stay curious. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lolita.